On March the 2nd, 2026, the man who controlled access to the world's most critical energy corridor for the last 35 years is dead. Ali Khamenei, supreme leader of Iran, the single most powerful figure in a country that physically sits on top of the Strait of Hormuz, died on March 1st, 2026. Iranian state media confirmed the death within hours, and within minutes of that confirmation, Brent crude began moving sharply in overnight trading markets. But here is what nobody in mainstream media is connecting right now. And it is the only thing that actually matters strategically. Khamenei's death does not resolve the standoff in the Strait of Hormuz. In the short term, it may dramatically accelerate everything unfolding there. Because the man who could have theoretically signed a nuclear deal with Washington is now gone, and the people fighting to replace him are not the moderates. Vladimir Putin was among the first world leaders to release an official statement. He called Khamenei's death, and I am quoting the Kremlin directly, a cynical murder. Putin did not say passing. He did not say tragic loss. He said cynical murder with no ambiguity and no diplomatic softening of that language whatsoever. Putin offered no evidence for that characterization. But the choice of that specific word in an official Kremlin release is itself the story worth analyzing. Every word in an official Russian government statement at this level is precise, deliberate, and calibrated for a specific audience and a specific strategic purpose. China's foreign ministry followed within the same hour. Beijing called for stability, sovereignty, and the prevention of external interference in its official release. In diplomatic language, that phrase means something very specific and pointed. It means, do not use this moment as a military opening. We are watching. We are already in position. And they are. As of this morning, Russian and Chinese naval assets are holding their positions in the Gulf of Oman from Maritime Security Built 2026, the same exercise they launched weeks ago. They did not withdraw when the news broke. They stayed. That decision to hold position rather than pull back is a signal that deserves far more attention than any press conference right now. Now, before we go deeper, let me be precise about what we actually know versus what is being speculated in the hours since this story broke publicly. Iranian state media confirmed Khamenei's death on March 1st. The official cause of death has not been stated with full transparency by Tehran at the time this video was published. Western intelligence agencies and several regional governments have not publicly confirmed an independent cause either, and that gap in official information is itself significant. What we do know with certainty is this: Khamenei is dead, Iran's succession process is now active, and 3 foreign navies are physically present in the world's most important energy corridor as it begins. That combination, a leadership vacuum in Iran, a live military standoff, and Russian and Chinese assets already in position, is something no analyst had fully modeled as a near-term scenario. So let's talk about what Khamenei's death actually changes strategically, because the answer is far more complicated than the coverage is currently suggesting. The first thing Khamenei's death changes is the nuclear negotiation timeline, and it changes that timeline completely and immediately. Trump had given Iran a 10 to 15-day window to present an acceptable deal. That deadline was already running when this news broke on the evening of March 1st. Any negotiation now has to wait for Iran to establish who actually speaks for the country. The Assembly of Experts must convene to select a new supreme leader, and that process takes time. Iran's constitution is clear on the process, but entirely silent on the timeline for resolution. In a country where factional politics run deep, that means weeks, possibly months, of contested internal maneuvering. During that window, no Iranian official carries the authority to sign anything that would bind the next supreme leader, which means Trump's deadline became functionally meaningless overnight. Washington now faces a genuine bind. It either extends the window, which reduces American leverage, or it acts militarily against a country in the middle of a constitutional succession crisis. Those two options carry completely different sets of international consequences, and neither one is clean or simple for an administration committed to a specific public posture. That is the specific and very real bind the White House is actively navigating in real time on the morning of March the 2nd, 2026. The second thing Khamenei's death changes is the internal balance of power inside Iran's military and security apparatus. And this is where the short-term danger is most concentrated. Khamenei was the single figure who could issue direct orders to the IRGC, to Iran's conventional military, and to its regional proxy network simultaneously, with unquestioned and undisputed authority. With him gone, those 3 structures do not automatically receive unified command from whoever comes next. Not immediately. Not with the same institutional weight and historical legitimacy. In military terms, a command structure without clear authority at the top is a command structure where individual field commanders may start interpreting orders more autonomously. In the Strait of Hormuz, with IRGC Navy assets already at elevated readiness, autonomous interpretation by individual commanders is the scenario that keeps naval planners awake at night. This is not speculation. It is the standard analytical assessment of what happens to any military chain of command during a sudden, unplanned leadership transition at the highest level. The third thing his death changes, and this is the most globally significant, is what Russia and China now believe they are responding to and how they frame their own posture. Before March 1st, this was a nuclear standoff with defined parameters. A deal was theoretically possible. A deadline existed. Diplomatic channels remained technically open on multiple tracks. After March 1st, Putin is publicly using the language of murder. China is publicly warning against external interference, and neither country has moved its naval assets away from the strait. What this suggests is that Moscow and Beijing are not reading this as the resolution of a crisis or a moment of reduced tension. They are reading it as the opening of a new and more unpredictable phase. And they are communicating that reading not through diplomatic cables sent in private, but through the physical position of their warships in the Gulf of Oman on the morning of March 2nd. In my view, the most important development right now is not the succession process in Tehran, as historically significant as that process is for Iran and the entire region. The critical question is whether the Russian and Chinese naval presence in that water is about to shift from deterrence signaling into something with a different operational posture entirely. We are going to break down what each of those fleets brought to this geography, what the hardware actually does in this specific environment, and why one particular Chinese vessel already positioned in that water may matter more strategically than every other warship in this story combined. But first, drop your answer in the comments right now. Do you think Khamenei's death makes a military confrontation in this strait more likely or less likely in the next 30 days? I read every comment, and on a story that is moving this fast and this unpredictably, I genuinely want to know where you think this is heading. If this kind of layered analysis is what you come to this channel for, hit the like button right now. It helps more people find this content when it matters most, and it tells me to keep going deeper. Because next, we open up what Iran actually has in that water, who commands it with Khamenei gone, and why the answer to that second question may be the most dangerous detail in this entire story. Stay with me, because what comes next is the part that fundamentally changes the entire strategic and military calculation in this region. Here is something almost no outlet is saying out loud right now, even as the entire world watches Tehran for signs of who comes next. Iran does not need a supreme leader to close the Strait of Hormuz. It needs about 48 hours and 6,000 naval mines. That number is not speculation. It comes from U.S. intelligence estimates updated through 2025 and cited in multiple open-source defense assessments. 6,000. Let that sit for a moment before we talk about what it actually means for the 20 million barrels moving through that corridor every single day. But before we get to the mines, we need to understand something about Iran's military structure that almost no mainstream coverage is explaining right now. The IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, is not a conventional military, answering to a civilian defense ministry the way Western armies do. It is a parallel power structure with its own navy, its own air force, its own missile units, its own intelligence apparatus, and its own chain of command that ran directly to Khamenei. That last part is the detail that changes everything about the current moment. Directly to Khamenei, not through a prime minister, not through a cabinet, not through any institutional buffer. With Khamenei gone, that direct line is severed. And the IRGC Navy, the force controlling the assets in the strait right now, is operating without its ultimate authority figure for the first time in decades. This does not mean the IRGC becomes rogue overnight. It has its own internal command structure and experienced commanders who understand the stakes. What it means is that the guardrails are different now. The single figure who could personally authorize escalation or personally order de-escalation no longer exists. In a standoff where two American carrier strike groups are converging on the same corridor, that change in the command architecture is not a footnote. It is a central variable. Now, let's talk about what those IRGC commanders are actually sitting on in that water, because the public conversation is almost entirely focused on the wrong assets. The fast boats get the attention. The footage of IRGC speedboats circling tankers is dramatic, and it films well. But the fast boats are not the strategic layer that keeps U.S. Navy planners up at night. What sits underneath the surface of the strait is the part of Iran's military posture that costs a fraction of what it would take to neutralize it, and it was built specifically for this geography. Iran operates a submarine fleet estimated at between 28 and 30 vessels, one of the most diverse submarine forces in the entire Middle East region. That fleet includes Russian-built Kilo-class boats, indigenously developed Fateh-class attack submarines, and approximately 23 Ghadir-class midget submarines. Each class is built for a different environment, and in the specific geography of the Strait of Hormuz, it is the smallest ones, the ones that look least impressive on paper, that matter most right now. The Ghadir class is 117 tons surfaced, 29 meters long, and carries a crew of 7 sailors. By any conventional naval measurement, it is not a formidable platform. A U.S. Virginia-class nuclear submarine displaces nearly 8,000 tons. and carries a crew of 135. On paper, these two vessels are not in the same category at all, but the Strait of Hormuz is not open ocean. It is one of the most operationally constrained waterways on the planet, and that constraint is precisely where Iran's doctrine is designed to operate. The usable shipping channels through the strait's narrowest point measure roughly 2 miles wide in each direction. That is the total navigable space available to every vessel transiting, military or commercial. Every supertanker, every escort destroyer, every logistics vessel is compressed into those same predictable, entirely chartable, unavoidable lanes. There is no alternate path through. A small submarine operating near the Iranian coastline in that 2-mile channel does not need to hunt its target across open water the way a blue water sub would in the Pacific or Atlantic. It simply needs to wait. The target will arrive at a position that has been calculated in advance with complete geographic precision, because there is no other route to take. Former Iranian Navy Commander Rear Admiral Hussein Khanzadi described the Ghadir's strategic role in statements cited by multiple Iranian defense outlets and later picked up by international monitoring services. In those statements, Khanzadi argued that the Ghadir is capable of doing what German U-boats did in World War II, disrupting shipping at choke points through presence and attrition, not direct confrontation. U.S. Navy Commander Daniel Dolan described the submarines in official statements as, quote, well designed for guerrilla warfare, ambushes, and anti-access operations, and potentially more expendable. That last word, expendable, defines the entire strategic logic of why Iran built so many of them instead of investing in a smaller number of large, expensive blue water submarines. Iran's doctrine does not require any single Ghadir to succeed. It requires enough of them distributed across approach routes to force a fundamental change in how U.S. commanders calculate the cost of entry. According to a threat assessment published in early 2025 by Army Recognition, the strategy is deliberately layered and mathematically designed around attrition rather than direct engagement. Multiple dispersed mini-submarines, combined with covert minefields along predictable transit routes, create what analysts describe as a layered denial zone across the entire strait and its approaches. The carrier itself, worth over $13 billion, would not enter the shallowest waters, but its escort ships, its logistics vessels, and the choke point transit create unavoidable windows of exposure. In warfare, even a small probability of a successful hit on a carrier carries outsized strategic weight far beyond the physical damage to the hull. The target is not just steel and sailors. It is the political symbol of American naval dominance, and damaging one changes Washington's political calculus overnight in ways that no military planner can fully contain or predict. But here is what I think most analysis consistently misses when it looks at Iran's posture in the strait. The submarines are not even the most powerful tool available right now. What I am about to describe is cheaper than any submarine in Iran's fleet, harder to neutralize, and arguably more strategically dangerous than any other asset Iran possesses in this specific theater. According to U.S. intelligence estimates updated through 2025, Iran holds between 5,000 and 6,000 naval mines in its current stockpile. That number has grown since 2019, not shrunk. That growth happened despite years of increasingly strict international sanctions, specifically designed to limit Iran's ability to import or develop advanced military technology. The stockpile includes the Chinese-made EM-52, a rocket-propelled rising mine designed specifically to attack the underside of large vessels from below, the most structurally vulnerable point on any surface warship. Western naval architects have long documented that the keel and lower hull are where large ships are weakest. The EM-52 delivers its explosive force directly upward into exactly that structural point, and the strait's shallow, narrow lanes create near-ideal geometry for this specific weapon system to operate at maximum effectiveness against the vessels transiting those lanes. But here's the critical insight that changes how you understand the entire strategic architecture Iran has built over the past 2 decades, and it has nothing to do with actually detonating a single mine. You do not need to detonate a mine to win the economic battle. The credible threat of mines is sufficient to freeze global oil markets almost immediately on its own, without a single explosion. The moment credible intelligence emerges that Iran has begun loading mines onto fast boats, maritime insurers pull coverage within hours, not days, hours. That is not speculation or modeling. It is precisely what happened during the Persian Gulf tanker war of the 1980s, and the insurance markets that operate today have not forgotten that episode or the financial exposure it created. No coverage means no tanker captain transits the strait, regardless of what any government says publicly or what military escorts are available in the region at that moment. No transit means no oil flow. 20 million barrels a day stops moving, without Iran firing a single weapon, without a declaration of war, without any act of open aggression that gives Washington a clean trigger. During the Israel-Iran conflict in June 2025, U.S. intelligence detected Iran actually loading mines onto naval vessels in the Persian Gulf. The Jerusalem Post and Times of Israel both reported the detection at the time. Iran did not deploy those mines, but the detection alone was enough to spike Brent crude from $69 to $74 in a single trading session, according to EIA data. A $5 per barrel move from a threat that was never even publicly confirmed. The weapon does not need to be used to produce its intended economic effect on global markets. Now add the drone layer that this week's exercise introduced with a deliberate emphasis that has not received the analytical attention it deserves in mainstream coverage. The IRGC Navy deployed armed drones capable of engaging both air and sea targets in significant numbers from 3 strategic islands, Abu Musa, Greater Tunb, and Lesser Tunb. Those 3 islands sit directly in the geographic center of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has controlled them since 1971. From those positions, drone swarms are already inside the engagement zone before launch. The U.S. Navy's defense against drone swarms is real and layered. CIWS systems, rolling airframe missiles, and directed energy weapons currently being tested on select surface combatants. But the financial mathematics of swarm warfare are deeply unfavorable for the defender. Each defensive intercept costs between $400,000 and $2 million, depending on the system used. A drone manufactured in an Iranian factory costs a fraction of that figure. You do not win a swarm engagement by shooting down every incoming drone. You win by exhausting the defender's interceptor inventory. The Red Sea campaign from 2023 through 2025 ran this exact financial playbook against American destroyers repeatedly, and the math was consistently unfavorable for the U.S. Navy across that entire period. Iran's version of the same strategy, operating from its own coastline and its 3 islands with Russian and Chinese surveillance assets now present in the strait, is the significantly upgraded model. What this suggests, when you look at everything together, the submarines, the mines, the island-based drones, is a specific and underappreciated kind of strategic risk. A command structure now operating without its ultimate authority figure in the middle of the most tense military standoff this region has seen in years. Not the risk of Iran launching a deliberate, coordinated offensive. That strategic calculation has not fundamentally changed with Khamenei's death. The risk is a field commander making an autonomous decision in a moment of high tension, a decision that nobody at the top of the chain explicitly authorized. In my view, that specific risk, unintended escalation from the middle of a chain of command rather than the top, is the most underreported danger in everything unfolding in the Strait right now. And it is the context inside which Russia and China are making their own calculations about what to do next with the naval assets they already have in position. That is exactly what the next section breaks open, what Russia and China each brought to that water, and why one specific Chinese vessel may matter more than all the warships combined, and what their next calculated move looks like now that the man who held Iran's chain of command together for 35 years is no longer in the picture. China just sent what the Pentagon officially classifies not as a destroyer, but as a cruiser, into waters directly adjacent to the Strait of Hormuz. That classification difference is not bureaucratic. The U.S. Navy puts the Type 055 in the same category as its own Ticonderoga-class cruisers, the most capable surface combatants America currently operates. And China didn't send it alone. It arrived with a formation that includes one vessel whose presence matters more strategically than any of the warships surrounding it. But before we get to that ship, we need to understand what changed about the Type 055's threat profile in late 2025, because it directly rewrites how U.S. planners have to model this entire theater. The hypersonic anti-ship missile, variously referred to in open-source defense reporting as the YJ-21, completed its final testing phase aboard a Type 055 in the Western Pacific in late 2025. Published estimates from open-source defense analysts put the YJ-21's cruising speed above Mach 6. Terminal velocity on final approach is estimated at potentially Mach 10 or higher. That number is not abstract. It applies directly to the same corridor where American carrier strike groups are operating right now within range of that specific weapon system. Here's why that matters in concrete terms. The entire U.S. Aegis naval defense architecture was engineered around missiles traveling at subsonic and supersonic speeds, below Mach 3. At Mach 10, the defensive response window for an Aegis operator compresses from several minutes down to a matter of seconds. The intercept geometry changes in ways the system was never designed to handle. The U.S. Navy publicly acknowledged this gap in congressional testimony in 2024, describing hypersonic anti-ship threats as a priority not yet closed through any operational system currently at sea. So what you have right now is a Chinese cruiser carrying a weapons system that the American fleet has no confirmed operational defense against, positioned in waters adjacent to the world's most critical energy corridor. That is not posturing. That is a structural change to the military environment that U.S. planners are working inside as of March 2nd, 2026. Now, here is the vessel that matters more than the Type 055 itself, and it receives almost no attention in mainstream coverage of this standoff. China also deployed a Type 805G intelligence collection ship. Its entire operational purpose is tracking U.S. carrier strike group movements in real time and relaying that positioning data continuously. The ship does not carry offensive weapons. It does not need to. Its job is to watch every carrier movement, every aircraft launch, every course change, and feed that data back in real time. Who benefits from that real-time positioning data in the current operational environment is a question analysts across multiple institutions are actively examining. Surveillance capability combined with hypersonic strike reach, operating as one integrated system in the same corridor, is the structural shift China brought to this formation. In my view, that pairing, the eyes and the weapon operating as one, is the single most significant military development in this entire standoff. Not the Iranian fast boats, not the Russian corvette. That specific combination of surveillance and hypersonic reach operating together. Now let's talk about Russia, because its contribution here surprises most people once they look past the headlines about fleet limitations after 3 years of war in Ukraine. Russia's surface presence in this region is genuinely constrained in 2026. The Stoichi is a 2,100-ton corvette. By any blue water combat measurement, it is not a formidable platform on its own. But Russia's contribution to this formation has almost nothing to do with the weapons physically aboard that corvette. What Russia brings cannot be measured in tonnage or missile count. When Russia is physically present in this exercise, this formation stops being a China-Iran regional drill by any framing Washington can apply in its public communications to allies or the press. It becomes a trilateral deployment of 3 permanent UN Security Council members, 2 of them holding confirmed nuclear arsenals, operating together in the world's most critical energy corridor. You cannot call this a rogue state provocation when a P5 nuclear power is physically present alongside the country being pressured. That framing is simply not available to Washington anymore. Every public statement the White House makes, every military option the Pentagon presents, every justification for action now has to account for the visible presence of those 2 permanent members in the water. That diplomatic weight is Russia's primary contribution here. And it does not require a single weapon to function. It operates through the politics of optics, precedent, and institutional leverage at the UN. Russia also brings something more specific that most analysis underweights: battle-tested electronic warfare systems, refined through 3 years of active conflict in Ukraine against NATO-supplied equipment. Not laboratory prototypes, not systems tested in controlled environments. Fielded capabilities that have been iterated and updated in real combat conditions with documented performance data. Electronic warfare in a naval context means radar jamming, communications disruption, GPS spoofing, and interference with the sensor networks that carrier strike groups depend on for complete situational awareness. When you layer Russian electronic warfare capability over Chinese real-time surveillance and Iranian sea denial assets, what you get is not 3 separate navies doing parallel things in the same water. What you get is something that functions in practice like an integrated operational layer, each country contributing the specific capability the others don't have and cannot replicate on their own. Iran provides the geography and the denial architecture, the mines, the submarines, the island-based drone capacity, the tools that make the strait costly to enter for any external force. China provides hypersonic strike reach, the surveillance umbrella, and a direct economic stake in keeping this corridor open and stable. Approximately 25% of China's total oil supply flows through Hormuz, giving Beijing a genuine and concrete strategic reason to be physically present here. Russia provides nuclear credibility, electronic warfare depth, and the diplomatic weight that transforms 3 separate navies into something Washington cannot publicly dismiss or minimize. None of these 3 countries holds a formal mutual defense treaty with the others. No Article 5, no binding obligation to respond if one of them is struck by an outside force. What they have instead is 7 years of deliberate coordination, shared procedures, communication protocols, and tactical familiarity built through repetition in the same geography. 7 years of shared exercises demonstrate actual operational capability. Formal treaties only describe obligations written on paper in a conference room. Those are 2 fundamentally different things. Now, here is the layer that almost no outlet connected this week, and it is the one that reframes everything about what Russia and China are actually planning in the aftermath of Khamenei's death. This exercise did not begin in the Strait of Hormuz. It began in a completely different ocean just weeks before Khamenei died. In January 2026, Russia, China, Iran, the UAE, and South Africa conducted a joint naval exercise in the South Atlantic. It was called Will for Peace 2026. It was framed explicitly as the first BRICS naval operation in history. A deliberate strategic milestone, not a diplomatic footnote buried in a press release. Russia's presidential aide Nikolai Patrushev stated afterward that BRICS should now develop what he called a full strategic maritime dimension. Those are not casual words from a senior Kremlin official. Think carefully about what that phrase means in operational terms. BRICS began as an economic conversation, trade routes, development banks, alternatives to dollar-denominated settlement systems. It is now running synchronized naval exercises across 2 separate oceans in the same calendar month. South Atlantic in January, Strait of Hormuz in February. Same governments, same month. The economic project and the military posture are being deliberately stitched together into a single, unified strategic architecture. And Khamenei's death did not pause that process. What the death of Iran's supreme leader actually does to this architecture is something Moscow and Beijing have been calculating since the news broke on March 1st. In my view, Russia and China's most likely immediate move is not military escalation. It is the opposite. A very visible, very public push for a diplomatic process that keeps them at the center of any resolution. Both countries benefit more from a prolonged negotiation that requires their participation than from a conflict that spirals beyond anyone's ability to manage or contain. A military confrontation in the Strait disrupts 25% of China's oil supply. That is not an outcome Beijing is planning for or seeking in any near-term scenario. What China and Russia are planning, based on the pattern of their public statements and naval positioning since March 1st, is to make themselves indispensable to whatever comes next in Iran. That means maintaining their naval presence as visible leverage while simultaneously presenting themselves to the international community as the responsible stabilizing voices in this crisis. It is a strategy that costs Russia and China very little to execute while simultaneously putting Washington in a structurally difficult and constrained position. Because any U.S. military action now happens in full view of 2 permanent Security Council members who are already publicly on record opposing it. In my view, that is the most sophisticated aspect of what Russia and China are actually planning right now. Not a war, a position, one that gets stronger the longer the uncertainty in Tehran continues. And the economic architecture underneath all of this, the number that ties every thread of this story together, is what the next section breaks open completely. Because when you hear what J.P. Morgan published as its official estimate for where crude goes if the strait closes, the entire logic of this formation snaps into focus in a way that no military analysis, no matter how detailed or how many warships it accounts for, can fully capture or explain on its own. Here is the single number that ties every thread of this story together more clearly than any weapon system or diplomatic statement. $120 to $130 per barrel. That is J.P. Morgan's published official estimate for where crude oil goes if the Strait of Hormuz closes. Not a fringe scenario from an obscure think tank, an official forecast published by the largest bank in the United States in a research note distributed to institutional clients worldwide. As of March 2nd, 2026, Brent crude is trading in the low to mid-60s. The gap between that number and 130 is the financial dimension of everything you have been watching unfold. 27%. That is the share of all seaborne crude oil and petroleum products that transits the strait, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. More than a quarter of every barrel moved by ship anywhere on Earth passes through that same 21-mile corridor where opposing naval assets are physically present right now. Add roughly 22% of global LNG trade, primarily Qatar's exports, flowing through the same passage, and the true scale of what is at stake comes into full and immediate focus. Now, here is the detail that most coverage is not connecting, and it completely reframes who is most economically threatened by any disruption in this specific corridor. Approximately 84% of the crude oil and LNG moving through Hormuz flows to Asian markets. China, India, Japan, and South Korea absorb nearly 70% of all Hormuz flows. The United States, by contrast, sources roughly 7% of its crude imports through the strait. American domestic shale production has significantly reduced direct U.S. exposure over the past decade, which means the country most economically threatened by a closure is not the United States. It is China, which imports approximately 25% of its total oil through this exact waterway. Think carefully about what that single fact does to the strategic logic of the entire formation currently sitting in the Gulf of Oman. China is not only maintaining a presence alongside Iran. China is defending its own energy supply chain with its own most capable warships. Those are 2 fundamentally different things. That reframes the confrontation entirely. The country with the most to lose economically from a disruption also has the most capable naval assets on that side of the standoff. The Dallas Federal Reserve published a scenario analysis on this question in 2024. Their finding: a full Hormuz closure drives WTI crude toward $100 per barrel under their base model. At $100 oil, their analysis shows a cumulative 1.3 percentage point increase in annualized U.S. headline inflation within 6 months. And that is the conservative scenario. Bloomberg's analysis from January 2026 puts Brent at $91 per barrel by late 2026 under their base scenario. Just sustained tension and reduced flow without a full closure. WTI crude is currently sitting right around $60 per barrel, almost exactly at the break-even threshold for most U.S. shale producers currently operating. Below $60, shale production becomes economically unviable for a significant portion of American producers. That is the floor the domestic energy industry needs to stay above. An administration committed to energy dominance has a structural interest in keeping prices above that floor, but not so high they reignite the inflation that defined the previous political cycle. That is an extraordinarily narrow band to navigate even under normal stable conditions with no active military standoff in the region. The presence of 3 foreign navies in the Strait makes it structurally impossible to control that band without first resolving the underlying geopolitical tension driving all of this. The bypass routes exist on paper but do not come close to replacing the volume. Combined alternative pipeline capacity across all existing options sits at roughly 8 million barrels per day. The Strait moves 20 million. That gap is not closable on any timeline that matters in a crisis. Not through rerouting, not through drawing down strategic reserves. At current consumption rates, combined global reserves buy approximately 2 months of buffer against a full closure. That is the full extent of the buffer available before markets face a structural supply gap. Now, bring this back to where we started, because Khamenei's death changes the economic calculus in a specific way that has not been widely discussed since March 1st. Under Khamenei, Iran's decision to escalate or de-escalate in the Strait was a centralized political calculation made by one identifiable authority with a known set of priorities. Markets could model that. Tanker operators and insurance firms had 35 years of behavioral data to work with when pricing risk in this corridor. That framework is now gone. With Khamenei gone and a succession process underway, the decision-making architecture in Tehran is temporarily opaque in a way it has not been in decades. And markets do not price opaque risk the same way they price known risk. Opaque risk commands a sustained structural premium that does not resolve until political clarity returns. That premium flows directly into inflation, into transportation costs, into the price of every product that moves by ship anywhere on the global supply chain simultaneously. The most powerful weapon in this standoff is the credible and sustained threat of uncertainty over those 20 million barrels moving through the Strait every single day. That threat does not require a single shot fired to begin reshaping decisions in Washington, in Brussels, in Tokyo, and in Beijing at exactly the same time. Putin called it a cynical murder. China called for stability and non-interference. Neither statement was aimed primarily at Tehran or Washington. Both were aimed at the same audience, the global economic institutions and allied governments that will ultimately determine how and whether this crisis gets resolved. 7 years of exercises, 2 oceans, 1 corridor, and a leadership vacuum in the country that controls the geography. That is the actual picture as of March 2nd, 2026. What happens next depends on whether Washington can structure a diplomatic off-ramp that a successor government in Tehran can accept, and whether Russia and China allow that process to succeed. Or whether they calculate, quietly and carefully, that a prolonged crisis serves their strategic interests far better than any resolution Washington is currently able to offer. In my view, that second question is the most important unresolved variable in this entire story right now, and it will not be answered in a press conference or a UN resolution. It will be answered in the water, by the ships that choose to stay in position and by the ships that eventually decide to move. If this changed how you see what is unfolding right now, drop a comment below. What do you think the next move is? A deal, a prolonged standoff, or something no one has fully modeled yet? And if you have made it this far, you already know this channel goes deeper than the headlines. Subscribe, because this story is not close to over and the next development could come any day.